Okay, good evening, everyone. My name's Mark Doherty. I live in Belfast, and I'm hosting this talk tonight for Trasna Nachira. So I'd like to thank Liam O'Sullivan and Stephen McCracken for organising this and really all they do to create this wonderful, unique resource. So before the talk starts, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Aidan McMichael, and say a little bit about him. So Aidan was born and bred in Ballycastle, very proudly so, on the beautiful North Antrim coast, looking towards Scotland and Rathlin Island. Although he now lives and works in Belfast, he still calls the Glens of Antrim his home and is drawing to the connections of its rich history, including tonight's subject, the photographer Robert Welch. It was through his parents' interest that Aidan first got an appreciation of history, genealogy, the natural world, and indeed photography. Later, after a lifetime studying and working in scientific and agricultural fields, he studied the history of Belfast at the University of Ulster.
3 of these in the cupboard, Brona.
Oh, sorry, I need to put everyone on mute. Sorry, I neglected to do that. And Aidan, you can unmute yourself whenever the time comes. Bear with me a second, everyone.
That's okay, Mark. I'll look after that.
Thank you, Liam. Appreciate it. So Aidan then studied history at the University of Ulster. And it was during these studies in 2006, quite a while ago now, that he first encountered Robert Welch. Always seeing the links between social history and the photographic record, Aidan was immediately drawing to Welch's wonderful photography. And Aidan has made it his business to promote the work of Welch over the past 10 years or more. This is not least to ensure that his photographs, particularly his maritime photographs due to his personal interests, are properly attributed to him and that he gets the credit that he is due. Certainly I've known since for the 30 odd years that I've been interested in history, Robert Welch's pictures have been pervasive the whole way through. Often unwittingly, I have been admiring his photographs and the light that they throw on our history. So Aidan has also been chairman of Belfast Titanic Society, how I first got to know him, since 2013. And he was previously the editor of their magazine QCD, Titanic. So he would regularly host meetings, obviously in person until COVID, but now these are online and are attracting an international audience. So he's an active member of the Friends of Ballycastle Museum, as well as the Kerry Historical Society, possibly subject for another talk sometime. And he keeps his connection to the Glens and his hometown very much alive and has helped to deliver a number of projects, including for Ballycastle Museum, Ballycastle in 30 Objects booklet. So Aidan has also been tour guiding in Belfast and further afield since 2008 and has spoken on a variety of subjects, including the history of Belfast Donegal Place in the very centre of Belfast, Lord Pirrie's yacht the Valiant, that's the chairman of Harland and Wolff, and Father Brown's Titanic photographer, another very famous Irish photographer. So Aidan is delighted to bring you this story and to get the opportunity to show the world in Ireland at the turn of the 19th century as seen through the lens of Robert Welch. So his images tell a story that all those with an interest in the history of Ireland will appreciate. So Aidan says that it was also the story of a man who was passionate about a whole range of interests and pastimes. He tells me that there's something in this talk for everyone. It is photography, history, natural history, and family history. So he has also devised 2 small photographic then and now projects for Belfast and Ballycastle, using Welch's photography to illustrate how things have changed over the years. Possibly the subject of yet another talk, but for now I will hand you over to my fellow Belfast historian, Aidan McMichael, for this talk. Aidan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark.
Sorry to interrupt just from the start. So please, in usual format, everyone, if you have any questions, you may put them into the chat box and I will ask them on your behalf, or certainly at the end, you will also have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask or discuss directly. So sorry, Aidan, over to you
No,
again.
no problem. And I think, yes, we probably all unwittingly have been looking at Robert Welch's photography. Nearly any pub in Ireland that you go into maybe has an old black and white photograph of a famous antiquity or a famous local scene, and that often is by one of the big photographers in Ireland, and specifically it might have been by Welch. So unwittingly, I think, is the word. The other thing that I can't show tonight is there is a short film about Robert Welch. It was produced by the BBC, but again, just for time, we can't dip into it. And just before we start, to thank Liam, Stephen and Mark for inviting me along to talk about Robert Welch, because I'm very passionate about getting his kind of name out there and for people to understand what he was and what he stood for and what he did in his lifetime and what he's left us, which is great. So just a kind of an official thanks to you guys. It's a great platform for history and heritage and getting stuff out there. But also this talk and the introduction there makes me think of myself and, you know, my own background, because this is what we're trying to do in the talk tonight about Robert Welch. And I do remember my own father on a Sunday taking the sort of the 3 younger children in my family, and I was second last out of 7 boys. And he took us across the Carrickmore Road on the north coast. And he said, look, you know, you see that rock there, that's the North Star Dyke. It's an igneous intrusion. And you see those rocks up there, that's the McEldowney Fossiliferous Marine Band. And, you know, those arches there, that's the way into the old coal mine. So I did get a kind of a very good grounding. And as far as my father went on then to take photographs, so I just sort of feel, you know, there's a good sense of my own sort of understanding of where Welsh was coming from in his own childhood and working with his own father and how he got his interests. But here I'm already starting into the talk. So let me share the screen and we'll get up some information for you here and we start working our way through. And just as I do that, it was a shame that we were all told to put on mute, because talks are about being interactive. And I do think that it is difficult when we're not allowed to share things. And, you know, that's just the way it is. But it is a good format for recording and getting the message out there. So can we confirm that we can see something on screen at this point in time? Mark, can you give me a thumbs up or?
Aidan, I'm seeing a lot of icons, but not specifically the PowerPoint yet.
Okay, well, we see if that just loads for a minute or two. We did do a wee test just before you all come into the room, so it was working. So we're just presuming that it's just sort of loading up at the minute. So what can you see just at the minute?
Just a desktop with even more icons and shortcuts on it than my own. So I'm not seeing the presentation yet. Is it open on your screen?
Yeah, so we'll just check till we see what has been shared. I'm going to stop the share and just start it again, Mark, just so that we can see that maybe just picks up the correct sharing again. So we'll do that again.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, folks.
So
the good thing about doing a few of these presentations is that we just mustn't get rattled whenever things go wrong. We just keep talking in it. So look, I hope you begin to see what's on screen here. And this is our journey tonight. We're going to take ourselves through what's on screen here. And, you know, obviously we're going to be trying to understand this man, Robert Welch, the photographer, and find out a lot more about him and maybe a few things that aren't so well known. But just, I hope you can see that there's a little signature that I've clipped out and taken on. I'm just going to kind of go into that so that you can have a better look at it. And I'm hoping that this is slightly more interactive presentation tonight, that we get to sort of think about things, although you can't directly talk to me about it, but I want you to think and to talk in your own head. So that's his signature. And just for a bit of fun, I actually did, you know, like the handwriting tests on this to see what it said about him before we move into actually finding out what he was actually like. So when we're looking at handwriting, you look at, you know, the pressure that he would put on the pen, and I think you'll agree there's quite a heavy pressure that he's put on. Also, whether or not it's slanting to the left or to the right, and it's slanting slightly to the right. It's fully legible. It's really well written. And whether or not the letters are connected. And interestingly, every single one of the letters is connected, although it's not a fully cursive signature. So just, for the fun of it, I just read out, and I have it here, what that's supposed to stand for in relation to understanding what that person might have been like. So the heavy pressure is supposed to indicate that he was good with commitment, but still can be rigid and in his behaviors. The fact that it slants to the right means that the person is open to new experiences and enjoys meeting new people. It's fully legible, and that's supposed to mean that you're self-assured and content in life. And the fact that all the letters are connected means that you're sort of orderly and methodical. So should we maybe bear all of that in mind as we're going through, just to see whether or not we believe that is actually what he is like as a person? And to follow up on that, what I've done is just given us some questions to take through in our heads as we're going. It's nice, I think, maybe at the end to reflect on what we've learned. And from my perspective, I think the questions are, trying to find out, well, what motivated him? Why was his photography so enduring? And also, how is Welsh significant today, in terms of his legacy and what we think of it? So I'm just beginning to illustrate some of the things that we're aware of. And one of the famous photographs of Robert Welch as a younger man is him sitting up on Fairhead up on the north coast, looking across as Mark illustrated there at the start of the talk to Rathlin and over to Scotland. And he's taken himself up on top of this rock. And a few years ago, I documented the same photograph. And I always like to do that with Welsh's photographs. It's not always possible, but on this one, it's obviously still there, although there's a slightly bigger crack in it. And I just personally wouldn't be sitting up on top of it. I'm too scared. I would have, the fear of heights syndrome. But the interesting thing is that he documented later in life very, very clearly his thinking around this photograph. And that's what he continually did. He took notes and he kept diaries. And later on in life, he did sort of go over everything. And he recounted the story that there was a 14-year-old boy that from the local area that he got to actually stand over the tripod at the back of the camera, and he shouted down to take the cap off the camera and to expose the glass plate for so many seconds. So although it's actually attributed to Welsh, it's technically this other boy who took the photograph. We don't know who that is, but it's an interesting thought. So the questions, let's try and carry those forward, and we'll review those at the end and see what we've learned in terms of Welsh. So this is a photograph of Welsh, and the reason why it's important about his own photography of self-portraits is that there aren't that many of them. I think I've tried to harvest all the photographs that I can of him just to show you what he looked like. But because he was behind the camera, therefore traditionally you don't see him. Even in the organizations that he was, president of, or that he was on the committee for, maybe he would have been photographing those groups, and therefore you didn't actually see him. So it is good that, there are some portraits. This one was taken by Alexander Hogg, who was a friend and colleague, and also interested in the natural world and participated in a lot of the outings that Welsh would have been photographer for. So one of the things that I think makes anyone very interesting is to understand where they come from, what family background they have. So I just wanted to illustrate, because it does give a good feel as to how he himself, one, became interested in natural history and photography, but also carried a degree of family baggage with him, which impacted on him throughout his life, and particularly in his later life. So starting off with his father. His father was indeed a very big influence on his life. You'll see that he's frequently referred to just simply as RJ, Robert John Welch. So RJ is the way that he can be referred to. But his father was born in Scotland, and I have surmised through looking at some of the advertisements for the work that he did in County Tyrone that he would have come over here maybe on an expedition selling possibly shoes. The reason for that is because he did end up selling shoes and other things in a shop. I'm just going to click in on some of these so that you get to see that David Welsh was, selling a lot of things in Strabane. This is in 1859. But that when we look at his wife's father was a shoemaker. So unless he was involved in that industry and came over and ended up meeting his wife and ended up getting married and staying here, we don't know all the full details. We can just surmise of the environment that he was working in. But also that he had aspirations as an individual to, you know, grow and develop. And you'll see here in the Derry Standard, he placed an advertisement that he was actually selling a lot of things off to make room for an expansion to his shop. So we know that he was ambitious and wanted to do something. And in the history part of it, we know that he went on to get interested in photography and to take that up as a profession. So his father then began to do photography, but he got associated with the Duke of Abercorn in County Tyrone, and in effect became the photographer to the Duke of Abercorn. And that we begin to point towards the fact that Welsh was exposed to a kind of a more upper class environment where he would have come across the likes of heraldry and book plates, etc. And we know that later he developed interests in these areas. Welsh's photography, David Welch that is, I saw somewhere that for 6 copies of a print that he was charging 6 shillings. And even in today's money, you know, when you do all your conversions, that's actually quite expensive. So, you know, repeatedly probably through this and understanding the circles that all these people moved in, you know, this wasn't for anybody who hadn't a lot of money. These people were, you know, visiting studios who were maybe in the what we would now call the middle classes and upper middle classes. But working for the Duke of Abercorn did give money to the family, and the father then, with his own personal interests and the mother's interests in the natural environment, used that to travel extensively, particularly from Anna, Tyrone and Donegal. And that's where there would have been exposure to the natural environment for Robert Welch as a child and as a young boy. And he began to be interested in all sorts of natural and antiquities at that point. And we can trace all of that back to his father's trips, basically. The father then ended up leaving. It was Victoria Terrace in Enniskillen, and there's a little story surrounding, as a political story really, because it transpired, it was reported in the local newspapers that the local MP who was Conservative, David Welsh, didn't vote for him, and as a result then he was let go of his tenancy in Victoria Terrace where they were renting, and he had to leave. So they then just basically went to a number of different places, and I've listed those there. They ended up in Bangor, but Robert Welch would have been educated in different parts of the world, basically, including in England at some point. And there's some photographs of David Welch, the father, relating to that period. But remembering that we know that the son Robert and other children went on to be photographers as well, that some of the photography, it's not that it got mixed up, but the plates and the prints would have been about the place, shall we say. So sometimes when they attribute a photograph, it may actually have been David Welch, the father, and not Robert Welch. It's just something to look out for. So the key point in Robert's life was the fact that the father died when Robert RJ was young. So in 1875, to be left fatherless. And I'm going to tell you the context of the other siblings and some of the sort of the troubles that happened there. So RJ, in effect, you know, took on the role of the main breadwinner, ultimately as photographer, but also just maybe within the family, and you'll see how that happens. And then they ended up moving from Bangor to Lonsdale Street in Belfast in the north of the city. I've just clipped out a couple of images from the BBC programme, and it sort of illustrates this is supposed to be the father standing on the Giant's Causeway with his camera. And then this is supposed to be RJ, who's down. This is the Giant's Causeway behind. I hope you can see that. And he's fiddling around with some seaweed. And this is the whole kind of grounding that Robert Welch had with his father. And I was reflecting that of the role of a parent instructing or teaching or educating their children in the natural world. And that's just a little clip from the newspaper for Welch, the father, who had a studio in Newry. So that's the father. The other context then is the mother and the sister. And, there's a lovely story here because he was very much fond of his mother and his sister, and they featured prominently in his life. And there is another sister who's mentioned here in the photograph as well. But the mother was Martha Graham, and she married the father, but she was originally from Strabane, as I've alluded to. She ended up that she practiced the concept of tinting the photographs, and we know that that was widely done to introduce colour to the photographs. And also the mother and the sister, Sarah, who's mentioned there, would have, shall we say, improved the quality of the glass plates prior to printing to allow, blemishes to be removed. And the sister would also have been involved in that, and maybe in tinting as well. So between them all, they would all have been involved in the studio business and the idea of both printing and publishing photographs, and taking that forward ultimately in a commercial sense. So the mother carried on after the husband died. So I just want to show you some of the stuff to show you how this has worked. That it ended up that Robert listed himself as a landscape photographer. And again, I mean, that's quite interesting. Maybe he just felt he was forced in the census in 1911 to describe himself. Instead of just being a photographer, he was describing himself as a landscape photographer. And that, I suppose, is a bit confusing because he basically photographed everything and was extremely good at everything. So why he picked it as a landscape photographer, I don't know. And maybe to differentiate from the fact that he really wasn't a studio photographer. And then really this is just to illustrate the death of the mother, because at that point he was left carrying on the business in his own right. The key thing from the mother's perspective, if we look, is that she was described as a publisher of photography in the period between Robert Welch himself becoming a full-scale photographer and the father dying. So I think that's important because she used the David Welch library, I suppose, to continue to earn money when she was initially in Lonsdale Street in North Belfast when the father was out of their lives. Sarah died in 1915 and the mother died in 1908, and we will sort of refer back to this. For both of them, I suppose the words were there that there was sort of a devastating loss on him, and publicly, the press would also have commented on this in the obituaries and so on, and I'll show you those when we come to that. There was a sister, I just don't have her name here, but she came over after Sarah had died because Robert, it turned out, not only was devastated, he ended up having basically a nervous breakdown. And the sister came back to look after him, much to his chagrin, actually, because he didn't really get on with her. And actually, maybe it improved his situation after the 2 years that he was fit to be on his own again. And he lived on his own till he died in 1936, just with a housekeeper. So that's his mother and his sister. Now his brothers, there is David Welch is listed on the grave, who died young, but it's William Welch was the sort of a bit of a carbuncle in the family because in his own writing, Robert Welch refers to the fact that he had a bad time with his brother and that he basically had to have him shipped off to Canada in 1901, and then the family went soon after that as well. But he refers to the brother as being a big drain on his resources, which he had plundered almost to the limit, and that's Robert Welch's own quote there. This other brother then basically he's described as a photographer. And there is some evidence that when he went to Canada that he operated as a photographer, although I've located the fact that during the First World War that he was he went to war basically from the Canada side, and he ended up actually is buried in an official military sense in Canada. So I don't know the whole history of that, but there's no mention of it in the Welsh papers, letters, or anything that was mentioned in the newspapers here. So we're not sure how Robert Welch viewed what happened to his own brother after, in effect, he got rid of him, shall we say. So that's just the context of where he kind of came from, both from his mother, his father, and his own sort of siblings. And it maybe just wasn't as straightforward, the fact that he was able to document this later in life in letters and in diaries to people. So just to clarify that he ended up in Lonsdale Street. The mother, as I've alluded to, she then was referred to as a photographic publisher. The name's spelt slightly differently. And that is because she was using the library of David Welch. And then we see here that this is the first time that it was referred to that Robert Welch, in effect, is photographs of Irish scenery in Lonsdale Street. So just to give a wee bit of context, I did find a photograph of Lonsdale Street, and just to sort of the imagination, this was in 1960s, not a particularly good photograph. So it was kind of one of the old houses in the north of the city. It's now gone. It was demolished and to make way for other things. So this was an example, and for those of you who know that Robert Welch, the son, played a significant role in documenting and visiting and being very aware of the antiquities history and natural history around the Ballycastle area, where I myself are from. So this photograph is very interesting for us all, because this is the old glassworks in what's called the Glass Island. It's on the promenade in Ballycastle. There's virtually no sign of it now, but it's thought that this is one of the photographs that, while it was labelled Robert Welch, that it was more than likely that it was the father, just due to the age of it and the people who've looked at what the building would have looked like and when the photograph could possibly have been taken. So it's just that little thing that when you get a family of photographers, it's hard to pin down who took what. So that's kind of a little more on the family background, and it just takes us into beginning to understand what he was like. I've just clipped another little photograph of the BBC film, because it shows, when we click into this, that everywhere around him were interesting artifacts. So the desk is full of his papers and shells and bits and pieces that he's collected, and there's books all over the place. So the documentary that they did about him was very accurate about him having lots of different interests, and that they're often related to individual or groups or sets of photographs. So what I want to do again is to sort of get you to think a little, just without providing an initial answer. So what I've done is I've lifted out the bookplate. So this was his own bookplate, and interestingly, it was designed by Carey, the artist, and we know that one of his interests was bookplates. And it's illustrating again about how well connected he was, because he just didn't get his bookplate designed by anybody. But what I want you to do when we're looking at this, and I'm sort of trying to talk your way through it, is to begin to see from the bookplate what he was interested in. How many things can we identify and simply in this one bookplate that would help describe his interests? So, in your head, you can begin to list those. So while we're thinking about that, and I'm going to come back and kind of answer my question, this illustration is taken from the Great Clare Island survey, that first sort of main multidisciplinary scientific expedition to the west of Ireland, where Welch operated not only as a conchologist, a shell collector, a naturalist, but also as a photographer. And I've just picked up another couple of photographs. So the first one is the actual original photograph that he took, that the bookplate was designed from. And then I did discover another printed out version of it that somebody was selling. So, later he commercially exploited the fact that this photograph was, a very good photograph in its day of the west of Ireland. So what we're trying to do here is trying to establish what he viewed himself as. And this is good because we've got his bookplate and he designed it. So we'll just sort of begin to list them out, shall we? And we know, obviously, because it's a bookplate, that's the first thing that he was interested in. He loved bookplates and collected them. And he has this kind of mythological Irish design or background to it as well. And, you know, he loved Ireland and its antiquities. So therefore he would have incorporated that into the bookplate. And we have, you know, either a Bronze Age or a Neolithic type artifact. And again, that expresses his interest not only in ethnology, you know, the study of man and their environment, but also just in the antiquities of Ireland. And then shells, you know, because there's lots of shells here, because that was his real love. And, you know, when we look at it, he really moved on sort of conchology in Ireland onto a world stage by redefining a lot of the shell work that had been done. There's a couple of conchologists before Welsh, but he really, you know, pushed it on and put it on our world map. And just the other couple of things then, you know, in terms of the interests, are the fact that it is the Clare Island survey, the fact that, you know, that he had participated in that and chose that specific photograph, and, you know, that he has illustrated it with the flowers. So, you know, that you know, is a main feature of his life, is always the flora and the fauna. And I'm going to mention this later on, because this actually is very significant as to what happened to him later in life. So I'll bring it back, the whole idea of Croagmore and the Clare Island and the Clare Island photograph. And just finally, the Robert John Welch, and we just notice here, it's got MSc and MRIA. And again, that's really significant because he wasn't really educated as such. And it's going back to his background, because he was born when his father died, he basically had to leave school and, you know, take over the business and run it. And I think it was always regarded that he felt that he was never properly educated. But later, as we discover, that he was recognized by Queen's University and given an honorary MSc. And again, I'm going to illustrate it. It's so typical of Robert Welch to actually promote himself as having his master's. This is something that he would have been so proud of. And actually, I would go as far as to say that his mother would have been so proud of, and he really makes a lot of it. And I'll show you that because I've looked at his diaries, and we can illustrate those from his diaries. So just to summarize then, going into all these interests, because we have them now. So the photography, not only for work, but to document events, and for insurance photography. And a lot of photographers did that to pay the way in those days. That he was a photographer, you know, of basically anything. And we will come up and see that. So as a naturalist, that he was interested in flora, fauna, and geology. And I have separated out the conchology, the shells. Oops, come off. I'm back. So the antiquities then, so it wasn't just the antiquities per se, it is that sort of ethnological interest that he had, the idea of interaction of man with the land and their surroundings, and in effect folklife, rural folklife. And he saw as an antiquarian things declining or disappearing, and he would have been very interested in photographing those. And also educating. So he was often involved in the photographic clubs in Belfast, and also the junior the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. And he's, you know, defined as having this real interest in passing on to younger people things that he had learned. And tourism, and we'll see that later on, because, you know, tourism is a modern sort of expression. And, you know, he's, you know, accredited now, not only through his photography, but he wrote pamphlets, you know, on areas and things to visit and why, and was very keen on tourism. And then heraldry. And I've just got a few things that I can illustrate some of these points with, and just collecting per se. And you'll see some of the things here to do with book plates and stamps and so on. And he just was a pure antiquarian, just trying to understand the old world and the fact that things were on their decline, and collecting those therefore for future generations. So I mean, the illustrations here, these are not his book plates, but because it's such a rare thing, I just wanted to put a set of book plates out. And it turns out there's a whole thing about book plates, and to this day people collect them and are interested in them because of their design. And there was, in the period that we're talking about, of the turn of the 20th century, there was a very good interest in book plates, particularly in the circles in Belfast that Robert Welch moved in. he did give a lecture specifically on heraldry. He probably gave lots, but I've just picked this one up. And as I said, that he would have picked up at an early age in the circles that he moved in the concept of heraldry and became an expert on it. And we see here that he's associated himself with Alexander Hogg, the other Belfast photographer who accompanied him. And then we see here some of the artists that were responsible for the book plates and heraldry locally. And we've got Carey, who designed his own one, and then Vinicum, who was one of the big Irish artists that worked for Marcus Ward in Belfast, who, as we know, were very key in the development of printed matters at the turn of the 20th century. So here, this is from Welch's diary. It's not very clear, apologies, but it's really pointing out that he collected stamps which he stuck into his own diary. He's actually stuck in the photograph that I've showed you at the start because it was taken to celebrate the award of his master's degree. And there's all sorts of things in here that really maybe it's quite interesting. It's like a scrapbook of his own life. And I do think it was because he was really proud of the achievements that he had overcome in his own life to get his MSc and to collect and to document and to be successful. So he documented all that in his own ways. What have we got here then? So here we have a lecture that he gave. It's just very intriguing because it is the sort of the Red Hand of Ulster. And he goes over about the fact that it's begun to deteriorate and people are representing it as a left hand rather than a right hand in heraldry, and indeed goes over the origin of the story of where the red hand came from, and dispels the myth around the fact that it was to do with people coming to this island and cutting their hands off and throwing it on the land and there being blood, etc. And he researched all of that and became an expert on it and lectured on it. So on this side, what have we got then? So I just can't see that. So there's too much to tell you, so I'm not going to concentrate on things that I can't see. So being a polymath, I think, is just so interesting because we would boggle at the idea of maybe him being an amazing photographer, but to have all of those interests all happening simultaneously. So let's just delve into the photography side, and then we'll move into the naturalist side, and then show the connections between all of them. And then we'll move on to sort of the latter years of what happened to him. So I mentioned already that through his work that he used his photography to earn a living through the fact that he was based in Lonsdale Street and sold prints, etc. out of that. And he would have had, if you think about it, his materials arriving there, the chemicals for development, and also the glass plates and the papers, etc. And he became, to a degree, a master in the development of all of that and the use of the plates. And we'll talk a wee bit about that because that's actually very interesting as to why his papers, his prints are in particular extremely good and long lasting, and you can really look into them, forever. You can kind of go right down into the grains of them. So for work, he worked for Harland and Wolff. He did the Gallagher Irish scenery, which I'll show you again. He did endless work just publishing prints within the newspaper fraternity, just illustrating little stories or antiquities. We know that in railway carriages that if you looked up behind you in the seat, even as far as the 1980s, because I remember them myself and I'm not that old, that there were scenes behind the seats, and he took those photographs. And then, as I said at the start, if you go into hotels and pubs and on ships, these photographs were produced everywhere. And I'm going to show you some of the Home Rule riots that he was commissioned to document in the 1880s in Belfast, because they begin to actually discover what he was like as an actual photographer. So we're going to actually maybe diagnose and critique his photography. So he illustrated journals and books for all his colleagues, and we'll see that through the connections that he had. And he did illustrate guides and postcards and all sorts of stuff, and scientific papers. And he photographed things for personal reasons, and he used photography as a way to document and to photograph things that he collected. So you'll see that there's a whole series of, means of transportation, or there's a whole series of things that were implements that were used on farms. So the fact that he sort of collected those things, he did it through his photography. But he also photographed other things, including golf and tennis, lots of different types of transport. And there's just other ways of describing what he did in terms of his photography. He did achieve royal assent in June 1900. And again, that features strongly in his own sort of records. And he promoted that in the newspapers, etc., as kind of being, in effect, the photographer to the Queen at that time. So just very briefly, because there's an awful lot, just to show you that, the newspapers, every time you opened them, there was a photograph of something through perhaps his work in Harland and Wolff, but also some of these antiquities. And here's Locherima, the Vanishing Lake, near Ballycastle. And you can't see it, but he would always have had his photography attributed to him when it was published in the newspapers, and that's something that we don't see now because his photography is commercially operated and it's not attributed to him. And here he's not only associated his photograph, but it's with the story of the peoples of the Clare in Galway. So he was able to actually put out the piece of history associated with the photograph, and that's another Harland and Wolff one. So that was the sort of more, I suppose, what he did to get a few bob out of the newspapers. The Gala Collection, you can collect these. They're all numbered. They're on eBay. Sometimes you can buy a whole load of them, or you can buy one. Just depends on your interest or your area. And you can actually just sort of look up and find out what was photographed by him in your area. And you see here, this is the one illustrating the Giant's Causeway. That's the organ in the Giant's Causeway. And just different things that he's photographed, and part of that collection. So, in effect, he was supporting the tobacco industry, wasn't he? Through people collecting them after buying a packet of cigarettes. So this is one or a couple, actually, of the photographs that he took up in Ballycastle and Rathlin Island. And I just wanted to use them to help illustrate the kind of photographer that he was. The collection ended up in the National Museums of Northern Ireland, the glass plates, and they haven't all been fully digitized. And it did take a long time for them to be catalogued due to various reasons, including the war and different things. It ended up over decades that Welch's collection was sort of quite poorly represented and been able to have been accessed. But this photograph is the photograph of Paddy the egg collector. And Welch, as we know, and what we're trying to illustrate is that he just didn't take the photograph just to be photojournalistic. He took it to represent the story and the fact that as an antiquarian, he was therefore able to recognize that this was something that would be lost over years. And the picture that he's trying to portray is that Rathlin represents the sort of the crossing between Ireland and Scotland, and that even the vernacular architecture would reflect that. So with a very thin thatch on the roof, and also with limited light reflection of the windows and the whitewash that's just around the windows to show in effect that they were very poor and could only afford a certain amount of whitewash. But his colleagues in the Belfast Naturalist Fee Club who accompanied him on this trip are actually in the photograph, but he's placed them looking, I don't know, somewhat timidly over to Paddy the egg collector, and I think he's contacted in the photograph a nice moment between, two very different types of people. And he's also got these other farm implements, in effect, lying about the place. But for him, they wouldn't have been lying about. He would have ensured that he placed them correctly into the photograph to allow his framing to take the photograph. So really, he's painting a picture, not actually really taking a photograph at all. He's almost as an artist, painting in the various layers of history into the photograph. So this would have been taken on the same trip. It's one of the fishermen on Rathlin Island. And the reason why I've put it up is to try and illustrate that he would also have been very interested in making sure that photographs, were multi-representative. So it wasn't just the fact that he was a fisherman and he's got the various boats and the lines that the man's working with, but he actually has the rocks behind him. So these are flints set into, the limestone. And this would have been very interesting to him, generally, as a naturalist. And the fact that he was able to get those into the same photograph, again, would have been a win for him as a photographer and as a naturalist. So just taking the theme a wee bit further, again, just this really interesting photograph in Ballycastle. And again, the fact that as a photographer, he just didn't stand there and take a photograph, that he placed almost in his mind's eye, great emphasis on arranging everything to his satisfaction. And obviously, because he was exposing the glass plate, allowing the people to be very still. But to place a man in the middle of the photograph with an eyepiece, to illustrate that would have been a function of the little the harbour here in Ballycastle, but also that for his perspective that this was a very interesting set of boats, because we've got the Norwegian Drawn Times and we've got an Irish curragh, which he's dragged into a certain position, or he's asked somebody to do that for the photograph. And all the other implements that you begin to realize that are actually sitting about are really his way of capturing just little glimpses of history. And, these, maybe some of them might be creels for catching of lobsters, that they are long gone now. Although because I'm a member of the Ballycastle Friends of Ballycastle Museum, I did notice that there is one in the museum. And, that's great, because we know that Welch photographed this in situ. And, if you walked into the museum, into that store now, you might not even know what that object is. But whereas we now know that Welch captured its actual use in his photography. So just here, I just picked up the fact that I'm just going to go into this to let you see a little bit about it. This is just really illustrating about that Welsh became an important part and feature of the North Antrim coast, and that his photography was then syndicated out through shops in Ballycastle and in other places. And, he was well known by 1887 for photographing local things, and that was of interest and would have made him money as well. So the way that we describe this in photography is that it's a tableau, this artistry that he's put it together. So it's something that we can bear in mind when we look at his other photography. So a good tableau here then, therefore, is the Home Rule riots. So again, despite the fact that technically he was asked to be almost a photojournalist, to go out and actually just photograph what he saw, that he didn't do that, did he? He got the crowd together, and that was a deliberate function of a photographer trying to get them to stand still, because you see some of them have moved in the exposure. But in the crowd getting together, he would have been, again, thinking of, well, what has he captured? But he's captured amazing things. He's got the ladies here, that, the shawlies of, that part of the world who were working in the mills, and they're wearing the shawls. So he has those. He has the RIC, gripped out, both inside and out. And he's got the boys in their bare feet. and he's captured that as well. So, you know, we think this is almost inadvertent, but he would have had a good idea that he was putting all of that together. And also, interestingly, he had this method of transport here to the left, because he was very interested in that, and he loved categorizing those. And equally, he could have had that out of the photograph, because indeed the horse is actually moved. So he could have sort of prevented that. And then here it is, it's published, and that's from the newspaper. That's his original photograph. And here we can see that there's a little story about it. So it was Bowers Hills Police Barracks on the Shankill Road. And it was the scene of the battle between the RIC and the anti-Home Rulers. So there was 7 people killed and 2 were believed to be rioters. So it's good just to look at that photograph and to see it as a tableau and what he was intending to do. So it's not so much a tableau, but just the concept, I suppose, of being an antiquarian and interested in ethnology and people and how they operated in their own environment. And again, there's a photograph that was published in the newspaper with the story, albeit that the photograph and the story were published 10 years later. But this is Janet, and Janet lived on the shore between Larne and Glenarm, and it was just a stone hut. But interestingly, it was thatched with seaweed, and she obviously lived, you know, an extremely poor life, albeit that she was probably content as knowing that was her life on the beach. And she collected dulse for sale and earned a few penny out of it. We actually can see that this is Robert Welch's pony and trap sitting here up on the top, and he's taken his camera down onto the beach and set it up in some way and able to photograph this. But he would have been very interested in the sea defenses that as an individual she'd created, and the fact that she had the seaweed all over the top of it. He would have loved that, been in his photograph. But she died then because she was washed away in the Great Cyclone of 1894. So it was tragic in the end. But nevertheless, he's captured that life of Janet. So I just said that I would mention the technical side of it. And when you read a lot about Robert Welch, you realize that he did go to extreme lengths to get a photograph. And, you know, there's a couple mentioned here. So the ship launch at Harland and Wolff, he nearly drowned. He was down actually in front of the ship as it was being launched, and the wave that it created, the wash nearly drowned him, and it destroyed his camera actually, and he documented that. And it was Rosamund Praegar, the sculptress, that said that if it was too wet for photography, you would find that Robert Welch would go off and collect shells. But that, you know, often he needed mirrors and white sheets and, you know, pages of a newspaper to actually create light, reflected light for himself. And that's mentioned in another little ditty that I have, and I'll show you that. He did reduce the size of the glass plate down from what I suppose he would have learned from his father, which I think was either 8 or 10 or even 12-inch, but he went down to a much smaller plate. And he changed papers over the years as well. And also in his development of prints, that he said himself that his prints were absolutely permanent prints. And it was because he you know, knew very well as a technician the properties of silver and platinum, and he opted to use the platinum for development, and that's called the Platino process, and it gives rise to very, very high definition in the grains that are used. So you can, when you go into his photographs, go right down on it. There's great contrast, and there, when you go into it, there's no sort of wishy-washy grey areas in between. There's perfectly contrasted. So he would have, you know, had this quality, contrast, durability, and cost in his head. To be frank about it, Platino process was more expensive, and, you know, cost at we think, looking back on it, for him wasn't really an issue because he wasn't really a money-making person. So the sister, do you remember, she dabbled in touching up photographs, and we can see one here. So you can see the before and after. So I haven't got in my head where this particular antiquity is, but it's to illustrate the fact that at the time it was plastered in posters, and then he took the photograph, and then those were doctored out. And I'm not sure if you'd seen that photograph that you'd ever have known anything was there. I have gone into this photograph sort of endlessly to see, you know, can I understand what it was? And something to, it's a declare of war, isn't it? So that's, you can just see the words there, declare war. So it must have been around 1914. I think that's the period that the photograph was taken, and I don't know in what context that he was decided to take that photograph. So the subsection of his life was the fact that he was the official photographer of Harland and Wolff, and the dates here, 1896 to 1914, are more specifically that he was the official photographer for the launches of the sea trials and the kind of marketing photographs for ships. I don't know the sort of the total period that he would have worked. We know that by 1915, when it became the Admiralty Yard of the war, that, you know, the work that he would have traditionally done did tail off. And this is where his life became, you know, associated with the sort of Titanic's photographer. And, you know, even in this presentation, you'll see that it's getting very slim mention. And it is because he was so much more than just the photographer for Harland and Wolff. I just wanted to show you some of the diary work to show you what he was doing when he was photographing ships, because it wasn't just in a daily basis photographing ships, he was doing other things. So for example, on the 9th of March in 1909, it's 1909, yeah, that he was looking at these different ships, including the Olympic, and, you know, and this is literally the words that he wrote. So it was the bottom of Olympic, and I'm not sure that that's particularly ship wording that he's used there, but he's just documented that he was in and out of the shipyards, but between it he was doing other things. And in particular, because we've already said that he spent a lot of his time up on the north coast, so he's there with a colleague, a friend, and a member maybe of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club, and he's even, you know, described it as being in the mist. And in the mist was very ethereal for taking photography, but also would have been a difficult place to take photographs as well. And he participated in the Glen Fesh, so it wouldn't just have been on a casual basis, but it was through the connections that he had, and we'll see who those people were in the Glen Fesh. So just other dates there, looking at the Olympic, and when the Olympic came back into Belfast to have work done on it later on, he was also involved in that in 1912. And the trial trip of Titanic, and these added in later that she was launched on May the 31st, and that was in his way of acknowledging that the disaster had struck at that point, and he added another little bit in, I suppose, just to acknowledge it. So busy man in the shipyards. And then just some of the photographs. There's so many here, I'm not going to go over them all. But it was just to show you the scale of some of the photography that he took. I mean, obviously he took all the well-known Titanic, Olympic, Britannic and Nomadic plates. Those are all the ships of the White Star Line, and the Nomadic is the tender that served Olympic and Titanic and Cherbourg. There's just a tiny wee bit there taken from his diary. It's not great, sorry, the photograph of, you know, him attending the launch of Titanic in 1911. But we know that it was actually the launch of Olympic, which was actually much more significant. And they painted Olympic white because there was something like 30 photographers from all over the world came for that. Now, I've just taken, this is Welsh's photograph of the Olympic on the day that it was going to be launched. But I've taken two other photographers as well to show you. And they're all, you know, great photographs in his own right. But I think there is something to suggest that Welch has kind of captured a slightly better angle even, but it was just his insight into structuring the framing of a photograph. One of these photographs, I think, is it this one, is William Green, and he was actually the apprentice to Robert Welch. So he was present there as well, but his is very low down, the angle that he's taken, and hasn't captured maybe the might of the ships that Welch has, because Welch's does stand out. And this was another press photograph, an English photographer. And again, it just doesn't seem to have captured the same atmosphere of Welch. The other thing to say about this is that you know, the concept of the photography to do with the White Star Line, the Olympic class of ships, in particular Titanic, ended up getting reproduced in newspapers hundreds of millions of times because of what happened to Titanic. But it's sad to think, you know, that not necessarily did Welch get any credit for that, or maybe even any royalties, because these photographs then were sort of spun all around the world in every newspaper since, basically. And then every anniversary they're reproduced. And then these just amazing interiors. So you see here just his initials and the fact that it's got a Harland and Wolff reference numbers. And he probably would have found those difficult enough to take because of the lighting conditions inside a ship. And then this is just to illustrate the scale of the number of books that there are. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds that are using his photography. And even this is the the Oceanic in the stocks in Belfast. But it's just to illustrate that, you know, even these photographs then we know were doctored, and a lot of the Titanic ones are known for being touched up. So what happened here was that there was something wrong in the plate, and they had to go in, and you see here that he scratched the side of the plate to tidy it up in some way, and also up here in the top right hand corner that he's had to scratch the plate. But when you see that as a sort of larger photograph, you almost you don't really see it, and this just looks like maybe water has come out of a hole or something. So I think he was quite successful in you know, the way now in your digital photography you just delete it, whereas he had to expose the plate, then develop it, and then print it up and see what it looked like, and then tidy the plate up. So it was quite a difficult thing, and often he was left that there were blemishes. What else just is there, just to have a quick guess? So this photograph, then, one of our attendees tonight at the talk is Mary Steinberg, and she has this amazing photograph. She has a collection of White Star photography. Mary, so you've given me special permission to show this tonight because this is in your ownership. And again, it's just to illustrate, you know, the amazing photography. And in this case, this is so different because it has the people associated with the shipbuilding. And just when you go into this photograph, it just gets more interesting and more interesting, because you just get to see, you know, them smoking and laughing, and, you know, their bicycles, and you get to see everything about it. And as I said, I like these guys here at the front, you know, and they're having a wee bit of a joke, like they're laughing. And I think that's lovely, just to understand that they finished their day's work and they've come out and they've seen the photographer and they've had a bit of a giggle to themselves. So I just actually picked those guys out, and they're run through, you know, a program to sort of colorize and to see what they actually look like. So that's just ultimately Robert Welch we've got to thank for, you know, documenting the lives and the faces of 1911. So that's just lovely. So thanks, Mary, for letting us have a look at that photograph tonight. So that's the photography from Harland and Wolff. And naturally, it leads on then to his other interests. So this is just something so interesting, the idea that when you look at some of the studies in the natural world, you know, there's sightings of mistletoe all over the place. But here isn't the one from Robert Welch. It's not dated properly. It's from a previous record, but he must have been just up on Cave Hill and he saw mistletoe on an apple tree and he noted down in a book, and now it's appeared in the scientific record somewhere. And I think that is so typical of the concept of him as an individual, that he would have constantly been looking out, and maybe he was up on Cave Hill just to take a photograph. This is another clip from the Ulster in Focus series, illustrating him with his camera. It's obviously an actor playing him, but it was just to help us understand what it was like as a photographer, lugging about the tripod with the bag of glass plates and setting up a scene in some way, and he would have to have come back and put his head under that and expose the plate. I've picked a nice photograph. I've visited this cave. It's absolutely beautiful. It's up Carrick-Reid at Larry Ban. It's in the quarry just to the west of Carrickgarried Rope Bridge. But this is the photograph that is possible with a digital camera. And, you know, this is to understand what it was like to be a photographer at the turn of the century, because you wouldn't have been able to have differentiated the light quality from a cave outside. So we can see Sheep Island very clearly, and these amazing stalactites and stalagmites and pillars, rock pillars. And it is a wonderful cave if you ever get an opportunity to visit it. But Welsh, he was able to get the photograph, but he wasn't able to see Sheep Island because of the nature of the exposure that he had to do technically. But it's a nice illustration that he did his best, and I think it's a brilliant photograph. So he was a member of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club, and this is the Naturalist Field Club in the sort of 1913. It was an anniversary outing of the field club, and they were up at the Giant's Ring in Belfast, in the outskirts of Belfast. But this is good because this has got a photograph of Robert Welch. You can just spot him here in the center. So he's just sitting. So we don't know, possibly Alexander Hogg took the photograph. And then I was referring earlier to that these are sort of the folk, you know, they had time in their hands, they had money, they were educated, and they had the connections, and therefore they were able to benefit from belonging to such an organization. There is a couple of people who I'm going to mention who were different, that they were maybe from the more working class, and we'll come across those just shortly. Picking out then that one of the members of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club was Nora Fisher McMillan, and this is a very full slide, I apologise, but it was because she herself documented in writing in 2003 all her memories of Robert Welch, and there are just so many amazing things that were said about him by her, in particular the idea that he encouraged her and other junior members, was endlessly patient, and she was urged to go to the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. Welsh introduced her to different people, and that she benefited from that. And she went on to have a lifetime career in conchology and was very successful, a published conchologist, and worked at the Liverpool Museum. She describes Robert Welch as very sweet, and he was one of those teachers, I'm just reading this, of natural history who would go to endless trouble for anybody. And I owe everything to him because he knew who to ask and who to get in touch with. And he was the most selfless man you could imagine. And that really does begin to illustrate it, doesn't it? So here he is in 1930 in Strangford Lough with Nora Fisher as a young girl. And they've got their shell filters to filter out the water and the sand to see these little tiny micro shells. And then later in Portstewart Strand in 1933. So it was only 3 years before his death. And I think you can see there, he's a bit of an old man. He's slightly bent over. And he's obviously really helping her to understand the world of conchology. And that's Nora Fisher there. And the interview was carried out by a lady called Julia Nunn, who was the second person to be from the island of Ireland of the British and Irish Conchology Society, and it was Robert Welch who was the first person to be president of the society. So they had that in common, and she interviewed Nora with the details of Robert Welch's life. So the recognition, and I did refer to that earlier, that in the end he was given an MSc by Queen's University in 1923, and this is the newspaper report. So that this is the photograph that was taken by Alexander Hogg, and you know, there's a little mention in the writing there in the newspaper. But if you go back to the diaries here that he's posted in, you know, an actual clip from the newspaper again, and you know, and he's written about the experience that he had on the day of graduation and so on, and he was very proud of it. And I just, you know, constantly refer back to the fact that he was always very proud of his own achievements and constantly diarized them. And I do think it was because, you know, he wanted to always his mother and his sister to have been proud of him. And maybe he kind of used this as a way of acknowledging that in his life. So Just moving on, the last sort of big section is about how connected he was, and this is the Belfast Naturalist Field Club and an outing to Ballycastle. There's two of them here. One of them is a subsection where they visited Murlough Bay, and he was there. This is actually a photograph of Robert Welch there. Do you see here on the right, up at Murlough Bay? And he was there, and they all were there, that subgroup, looking at shells. Shells not something I personally know an awful lot about, so it is interesting, you know, they spent a lifetime looking at shells. So this is the group. Then they would have had arrived by railway into the town. It's gone now, but they did come in by railway, and the Antrim Arms is where they would have had lunch, and then they would have gone out to Murlough Bay or across to Fairhead, which was mentioned earlier, or indeed across to Rathlin Island. And as part of the group, you would have had the local members who would have been the Douglas family, and they were very interested in birds, and the Gages of Rathlin Island, who again documented and you know, published drawings of flowers on the island and birds. So I've just picked out a few people who he was connected to, and I did mention earlier that he was at and documented through his photography the Glen Fesh, and we know also that Francis Joseph Biggar was a primary figure in the Gaelic revival, and in particular the setting up of the Glen Fesh. So he and all of these people that I've picked out wrote letters. So they corresponded, and this is Robert writing to Frank. And I just thought it was really interesting because he talks about basically going up to look at obviously a rural church, and he's identified at some point on the journey that there are graves in relation to, you know, maybe the 1798 United Irishmen story, and that would be particularly true in North Antrim, as we know. But he had a bit of a row with the parish priest, who told him just to head away. You know, he didn't want him coming down for some reason. So I just think that's nice, the way that they corresponded to help each other understand what they were up to, and that it was always sort of historically or heritage related. You know, it wasn't just chit chat. It was, you know, things that they were doing in relation to their interests. And, you know, Francis Joseph Biggar, you could talk about forever, because he was a huge antiquarian and Gaelic revivalist. So he was really interesting in his own right. Crawford, and again, this is interesting because he was kind of from the other side, should we say, in communities. So this is Fred Crawford, who is known as the Larne gunrunner, or the UVF gunrunner of 1914. And interestingly, he spent his summer holidays in Ballycastle and ended up getting some of the guns in through the docks in Ballycastle, and they fell off the boat there. So they didn't actually land. So here we have Robert writing to Welch, and isn't it interesting? It is slightly more mundane, but it is about the collecting, isn't it, of the stamps and the sorting out of all the clippings and all the things that he's been doing that I've been illustrating. So he's referred in particular there, look to the Belfast Telegraph, of all the clippings that he's been doing. So we obviously like to keep everything and to document them all. And then Jackson was an English conchologist, and I've put this in because it illustrates the sort of humour that Welch had. And Welch has come up with a photograph of an event, shall we say, and it was his visit to Derbyshire, to the shell caves of Derbyshire, and he's sent this back. He sent this back to Jackson, and he's come up just with a funny photograph and just like a humorous anecdote on it. And it wasn't the only thing that he was humorous with, and he's come up with something that was humor of a different time, wasn't it? So that we don't find them hilariously funny, but we can see that he was trying to be funny. And he just says, "Let me dressed fine as I will. Snails, flies, and worms exceed me still." And, you know, Welch would have maybe taken that photograph of him and sent it back to him. And that's the real photograph of the cave that's been illustrated in the old photograph of Welch. And then the Welsh photograph of the British and Irish Conchology Society, and you'll see that Welch isn't actually in that photograph. So it's a Welsh photograph, but he's not actually in it because he was the photographer. So The Praegars then, he was connected to them, the Robert Lloyd Praegar, the great naturalist across Ireland, and also to Rosamund Praegar, and they were both, she's sculptress, they were both members of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. So he would have been, you know, part of the different strands of interests of the Praegars within that. And Praegar, Rosamund, drew this little drawing of Welsh. And it was to that she said that if it was too wet for photography, that he would basically go shell collecting. Apologies, because there was another little plus sign there. This is the summary, so I'm not going to go over all of these, but it's just to let you see the scale of some of the people that he was connected to. And I did mention that there was a welder in Harland and Wolff, Robert Bell, who was a member of the Belfast Natural Field Club. And this is Bell here out doing collecting for a thing called zoolites. And we know that Bell was very friendly with Robert Welch and sent him a lot of specimens. And, you know, maybe when he collected something, he just automatically sent it down to Robert Welch to have a look at, to see what he thought of it. And a lot of these people ended up that their collections were given to the old museum in College Square, I think it's called, in the centre of Belfast. And that was the progenitor of the Ulster Museum in Botanic Gardens. So those collections that they all collected, all their specimens, ended up kind of in the public domain. So you see there's just a whole range of people, including Professor Charlesworth, who lived in Ballycastle, and he was a geologist, and just another connection there. So there's a lot to say about how these people were interconnected. So just to finish off, his latter years then, and to give you a summary of his own timeline then, that he did, you know, amazing things in his life. And I've just included a few things here that maybe just weren't articulated so well through the talk tonight. Certainly that there's a lot documented in the newspapers and so on, but we know that he did make a radio broadcast in the 1930s. And I did check to see whether or not any records were kept to see if we could hear what he looked like. Apologies, there's a little typo there, but they don't exist, those broadcasts, so we can't, you know, unfortunately listen to him. But latterly, and I'm going to go over it, the glass plates after he died were bought by, sorry, they were given to the Belfast Naturalist Field Club, and then from there they were put into the Ulster Museum, but just very close onto the Second World War, and then that impacted on anything been able to have been done with them, and eventually I think by the 70s or even into the 80s, the kind of documenting of the cataloguing that needed to be required eventually got done. And it was really only up until, you know, after the year 2000 that they began to even think remotely of how you could digitize some of the plates. So while there is a lot of photography exposed out there, there's a hell of a lot more that haven't been digitized. And once that happens, you know, maybe a lot more of it could be surfaced, and people could see the photography relating to their own areas. I just put up, you know, the Clare Island, just in case anybody wasn't quite sure where that was off the west coast, and the Clare Island survey, and it's mentioned just there in the timeline. And then also he participated in the Lambay Island, and I was just pointing out where that it was as well. So the little island down here that's below Lambay is Ireland's Eye, and Ireland's Eye is the title that was chosen to, you know, represent his sort of naturalist interests, of the book that is compiled from a lot of the photography of Robert Welch. And I'll just show you the cover and the title of it again at the end before we finish. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, to get it, because it's easily available on eBay at a low price. So the decline is characterized by some of the things that I alluded to earlier. His own you know, demise, shall we say, after his sister had died, particularly in 1915, and the coinciding of that, of the falling off of work in Harland and Wolff because of the war, and the fact that it became Admiralty rather than sort of shipping liners, he himself wasn't good at finances, and he gave more away. And Praegar had noted in his work about him that, he was so generous, he just basically gave things away, and he wouldn't have been interested in making any money. And we know also, I had mentioned that he basically probably ordered the best of everything and maybe couldn't have afforded it. So the fact that he was using the Platino process for printing long after others weren't able to afford it and had gone back to using silver because it was cheaper, he therefore was disadvantaged financially. And also his sister was looking after the finances, and when she was gone, that those went to pot. And anyway, wasn't he too busy in the front room doing all his clippings to be worried about finances? So there was a bit of a decline there, and I've mentioned about the family. So the reason why I said that I would bring forward the Croquemore plate of Clare Island, and there it is again, just to remind you, is that he then documented in his own letters to people that he spent a number of hours lying in damp, wet grass taking this photograph. And you can see that it is very damp, the cloud's very low, and that he believes that his rheumatism was attributable to this event, and that it dogged him and came back later in life, and that he suffered from rheumatism. So that, I think that was interesting and disappointing. And I brought back the Lonsdale street photograph because this is where he died, and it was just the housekeeper and him living in the premises at the time. And this is a photograph then basically illustrating that because we've seen a number of photographs of him through his life, I think you can admit that he's sort of failed here really in comparison to some of the other photographs that we've seen. But this was taken at the time when the Stormont government had acknowledged through the work that he had done to give him a stipend or a pension. And I think to date, he's the only person ever to have got, like a free pension, basically from government. And I think that's very, very significant. And it was the colleagues and all the connection and all the people that you see that were listed in the earlier slide that lobbied on his behalf to get him that money so that he was able to survive. And then this is really the sort of the demise then, when we go in to have a look here in the newspaper, that after he died, then it says then that he basically, there was a need to go out and look at the creditors of the money that were owed then. So I think that was a sad reflection on a life well led, on a very successful life that potentially could have been financially very viable, but it really says that really the finances weren't at all important to him, and he was able to move on. So this is the grave, and Mark and I were just talking about it earlier, just before we started, and it is interesting because when we look at this, he is not listed as a photographer. He is listed as a student of nature, and it's the father who's listed as a photographer, and no mention of the brother in Canada, even just by reference. And we don't know what happened to the other brother that's there. So I think that's a lovely grave, and I know, Mark, you've been to it a couple of times, and it's very accessible. If you're ever in the Belfast City Cemetery. So obituaries then, these were very significant and very, there's lots of them. And I just wanted to show you a couple of them. This was the kind of thing that it was said, that Welch was an Ulster scientist and a man of many parts. And again, it doesn't mention sort of openly at the top line, the photographer. You have to sort of go into that to see that he was a photographer. The death of Welch, the well-known scientist. And then in this one here, the fact that the Tourist Development Association gives a tribute to Welch because he was really almost the father of modern tourism, and they recognize that. And then there's one here, and just that he was a man of many parts, and that's what we have significantly, I think, found tonight as we've moved through. But finally, on this obituary, the idea that even after he died, which was a significant time after his mother had died, that it was known that, he really had this love of his mother, and that I've tried to illustrate that by, the fact that he was always very proud of the things that he did. And I think it is because he exhibited this constant love for his mother. And there's a number just of obituaries. Maybe we just have a look at a couple of them. Hogg, in terms of the photography, his eye for composition and artistic insight are conspicuous in all his work, and he observed the keen perception of the value of illumination and the play of light and shade. And I think that that has been illustrated just as we've moved through, because we see that he did carefully use light in all his photography. And we know in the notes about his photography that it was said that he was able to manage the light by borrowing it through reflection. Praegar commented on the concept of him being a naturalist, and also that he had this huge variety of interests, and it wasn't actually easy to categorize what kind of a person he actually was. And that he's listed out what he believes some of them were. And you see the heraldry and book plates get a specific mention there, and also photography. Stelfox then picks out him as a naturalist. And I like that. He says, look, he was not a conchologist, he was everything. So I think that was an amazing thing to have said about you, isn't it? So, you know, while he was actually a conchologist, he was also basically a man of many parts. And then the Jackson, who we looked at, the humour on the cards, that he was able to get him over to Derbyshire, where that humour came from. And here he actually tells the story of needing extra light in a cave, and Welch just basically heading off to a nearby cottage and borrowing a mirror from the dressing table. So it was a very nice thing for whoever lent it to them, so that he was able to get his photograph. So that was the latter years. And just to round it all off, some reflections and how we might get to know better. And just to revisit our questions, you know, the concept of what motivated him, that's what we were trying to think all through his life and this journey that we've taken in understanding him, and also about, you know, his photography and why it was so enduring. And then, you know, what do we learn from his life, and what significance does it play today? So I've just put up some reflections, and you'll have your own as well. And I think, you know, we do think that his bread and butter, his earning capability, and all the photography in the newspapers, etc., that was his bread and butter. But that significantly, even through photography, that his first love is obviously his naturalist interests. And that is more than ever shown in the bookplate that we looked at. And that word, and I didn't even know it was a word, a muscophile, you know, a molluscophile, the idea that he was interested in shells. And spent a lifetime becoming, you know, like a world expert on shells. And I didn't list the couple of things that are named after him. So he had this amazing contribution to science in all scientific fields. And we have this amazing record through his photography of these Irish antiquities, and, you know, future generations have these. In particular, the ones that are related to, you know, the idea of looking at humans in the environment, and the idea that these things were disappearing, the vanishing rural folkways. Yes, he was Titanic's photographer, but, you know, in reflection, it's just, you know, a moment in time. And the photography that he took of the White Star Line, the ships of Harland and Wolff, are amazing, and produce a maritime and industrial record and social record that is second to none. And that he was really a neutral antiquarian. He wasn't judgmental. You know, when we look at those photographs, there isn't any other kind of commentary that you would come up with. They just are a neutral assessment of the photographs and their content. And he simply had many, you can't say enough, dimensions. And just a little comment that, you know, his work remains poorly curated, you know, and it's hard, there's no central source to go and to get stuff. In the getting to know, I have included some of the sources. So we've got Ireland's Eye, which I've referred to a couple of times, written by Evans and Turner. And that's a really good sort of treatise on the photography and the meaning behind the antiquity, I suppose, that and the natural world that he's photographed. But what I'm just saying here is that there are a few things that you can go and do. So if you're in the National Museums of NI at Cultra, there's an exhibition called Titanic, and a lot of the photography there is from Welsh. The online photographic collection of Welsh is available at the National Museums of NI website. If you fancy collecting stuff and become more Welsh in your outlook yourself and become a bit of a collector, the Irish Views Scenery cigarette cards are on eBay. You can get them for a couple of £1 each, or you can buy more. The Ireland's Eye I've referred to. The Belfast Archive project has surfaced recently some new photographs from Robert Welch, and I would encourage you to have a look at those. There are actually some more informal ones, which I really like. You know, just Google him and look out for that concept of his photographic tableau, and, you know, put a critical eye on all his photographs and see what's in there and how he placed them into the photographs in an artistic way. There is a book called A List of the Photographs in the R.J. Welch collection in the Ulster Museum. I think there's 2 volumes of it. I certainly have it myself, and it is just the list of photographs. And you can also visit his grave. I've actually just got here exactly where it is. So when you enter the graveyard, you actually just drive up the main avenue to the right, and it's just at the very, very top, facing due north. So it's actually literally almost one of the easiest graves in the whole graveyard to find. And I think he's the 4th or 5th grave in from the main road. And it's quite interesting because when I looked at his grave, and Mark, you probably did the same, the first 1, 2, or 3, or 4 of the graves, they're all people as well who were of merit and interest. I think one of them was the first person to put ivory into a golf club. Another one was a heart specialist. So, you know, there's fascinating history, as we know, for people who are interested in doing tours of graveyards, because they tell huge amounts of stories of the people who are buried there. A byline. This is what Welch said. I'm going to leave you with this. Flies always walk up a window pane and never down. Have you ever noticed that? And finally, this is his memorial, I suppose. And I think most interestingly is that it is on a photographer's shop in Strabane. So this is where he was born. And that's just the close-up of the blue plaque. My personal belief is that he shouldn't be blue plaqued, if that's a verb, in Strabane, because I just don't think it's important enough. I think he should be sort of blue plaqued somewhere in Belfast, or if not blue plaqued, a statue or something. And I have lobbied for that and continue to do so. So that's all I have. And don't forget that if you want more information, I've pointed you in the right direction, but also any comments or if your own personal knowledge is welcome, not just questions. So that's you for your talk tonight. And I hope you've got something out of it and learned a little bit about Robert Welch.
Thank you, Aidan. We certainly learned more than a little there, and it's very good that your talk didn't just focus on his photographs, which are endless thousands of them, and you can spend, I imagine, a lifetime studying and still find things out. But it's lovely to find out so much about the man. There's so many aspects to him, and it looks like he was driven by his genius, as it were, like many great people in arts and science were, to his own detriment as well, which is interesting. But I will say no more for now. I'll just recount a few comments and a few questions as well. First one was from Niall, who must be a Glensman, I assume himself, McMichael. He said about several of his most famous photographs were taken in the townland of Brockmore in Glenshesque, which is very close to Ballycastle. And then you can see the deliberate inclusion of various types of farm carts and implements, and it's brilliant to have this social history of the area as such. And just to jump to, sorry, I've just jumped to another area, a completely different area. Someone called Donegal Railway, so railway enthusiast in Donegal, saying about Robert's photographs being very important for railway tourism, and not only used in Ireland but also in England. And in the 1930s, he wrote that for over 40 years he had supplied more than 10,000 Irish views for display in British and Irish carriage panels, which is mind-boggling.
Yeah, and you wonder what happened to them all because a lot of the carriages have gone. But yes, I mean, I do remember them, and this is the thing in that you don't remember the person, you just remember the images. And reflecting on what Niall said, that it turns out that he was nearly everywhere, and he did photograph so many different things. And I was recently looking at the story of a Titanic victim who was from Clonbur in Galway, and we were recounting that story. And when I went over that, it turns out that Welsh had visited Clonbur and had photographed the main street. So, he's a great collection. And I know there are other photographers in Ireland who have documented all arts and parts, and particularly antiquities and the likes of that. But Welsh is another great resource for that. And, because he gave a lot of photography away, probably a lot of that photography is going to emerge over the coming years. And the website that I referred to that has surfaced 20 or 30 of those recently is an example where there are still sort of personal collections of his work coming to the fore.
Yeah, but he must never have rested, really, such a huge volume of work in so many areas.
Yes, and he probably just was full of energy, and goodness knows what he was thinking whenever he was on the various journeys, because they did take time. Whereas going up to Ballycastle now is an hour and 15 minutes, whereas that could have been half a day travel for them. So he maybe made a lot of his notes, and would have done a lot of his documentation on his travels as well.
Might have taken more than a day to get to Clare Island.
Yes, I think it must have been fascinating for them all to have got together. The idea that was one of the first times that you got a multidisciplinary approach to the natural world, where all those disciplines came together, and kind of their added value was more than the individuals. It became a bigger thing.
That's interesting, actually, because he was involved with a very important project in Ireland. He was there for the launch and the departure of the Titanic to capture the best images of them. And you also mentioned he was involved with the Glens Feis. Would he have been involved with that from the start? Because that was a very important event, certainly in the north of Ireland, in the Celtic Revival, the Gaelic Revival.
Yeah, so the photographic collection that I referred to, I'm just going to click it up so I can get the proper name. Yeah, the Belfast Archive project has some of the Glen Feis photography that was taken by Robert Welch on it, and including a couple of other photographers that aren't known at all. And that's one of the functions, by the way, of the Belfast Archive project, is to surface, personal collections of photography. So they have surfaced somebody who had a Welsh collection, and in addition, some other photographers that happen to also have concentrated on the Glen Feis. So there's some nice ones of the Glen Feis there, if anybody's interested. The Belfast Archive project.
I'd personally be very interested, because my wife's family took part in, who were Irish dancers and musicians, took part in the first Feis, and I assume subsequent ones as well. So I'm wondering if he photographed some of my wife's family. So I'll certainly be coming back to you on that one.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask another question that was asked from Stephen is there any of his family still alive today? Like, obviously be through family connections, as he never married himself.
So the two connections that we have for Robert Welch are through this sister, and I just can't remember her first name, but she ended up in Leeds, and I do believe there was family there. She certainly had one daughter, and the story behind it is that actually she, for some reason, also had I think been put out of her home is too strong. But it suited her, shall we say, to come to Belfast to look after her brother after he had the nervous breakdown. But in other words, there's more to it, that she had sort of reasons to leave, and we understand that she wasn't able to stay with her daughter. I've seen that in different letters, and including Robert himself wrote a little bit about it, and he said that she wasn't able to stay with his daughter, so she came to stay with him. And maybe because he was so good-natured and good temperament, he allowed it. despite the fact that he didn't really get on with her. So that's one connection which could be followed up, because I think it would be interesting to see if they have any of his photography. But secondly, the brother William had 4 children in the end in Canada. One of him went down into the States, but then went back and died in Canada, and he had at least 1 daughter who would be alive. So I've kind of done a wee bits and pieces of the genealogy of it. So it's possible that that they may not know. They may know. We don't know. I think it would be interesting if you sort of contacted them and said, you know, your great uncle was, you know, a great man. Do you know anything about him? And if they didn't, it would be interesting to tell them.
Of course, that would be a tinged sort of family connection, because his brother took such advantage of him, which actually is interesting. Like, he was such a sweet man that he allowed his brother to take all of his money, by the looks of it, before he rejected him, or bought his ticket to Canada, possibly.
Yes, that is interesting. I also think it's interesting the brother was, you know, he fought in the First World War and somewhere, and therefore was also injured and was hospitalized. I know that. But also then latterly, sort of, you know, 50 years later, whatever, to have died and then be buried in a military grave. So how that happened, I'm not sure. I think there's there's probably a story there, and whether he became a photographer in his own right, I don't know.
There's room here for quite a thick biography, I think.
Yeah.
Have you started writing yet, Aidan?
So we'll see. I think that it is a question about being able to pull a lot of it together, because there are these different sources, and you know, the fact that it has been documented in the Ulster in Focus BBC documentary or drama, but it's very dated now, and it was just a dramatization of what in effect has been said about the father in particular.
Is that easy to access?
Well, I have a copy of it, and I would like at some point to surface it, because the Ulster in Focus does have a Facebook page for the BBC, and they have got some of their archive on there, but not this particular one. But if you're interested, I'll give you a private view.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's easy, as we're nearly neighbours anyway.
Yeah.
Now, there was quite a lot of compliments, but I'll just ask one more question, maybe time to wrap it up. Richard Graham has asked what stands now on the site of 49 Lonsdale Street.
Yes.
And I'd add to that, would it be suitable for blue plaque?
Well, there's a couple of things to say about it. Is that my view is that it's sort of bigger than the blue plaque. I do believe that we're talking about an individual who has a much greater significance, you know, not just in Belfast, but on the hook, therefore, of the sort of maritime and industrial history down in Titanic Quarter, where I believe you could sort of surface something. But I just don't think the blue plaque is big enough. So for me, I'd be sort of saying, yeah, there's little industrial units in Lonsdale Street, but I just feel that the city or someone or something needs to think bigger than that, and to come up with something, you know, a statue or a piece of sculpture that's dedicated to him or something like that. I have approached the Maritime Belfast Trust to, you know, promote it, but you know, these things do take an awful lot of knocking on doors. So I'll continue to.
Yeah, please do. I'm envisaging a bronze statue of him with his tripod on the Titanic slipway, maybe, or something like that. Would be quite dramatic.
Well, yes, it could be. Although, you know, he wasn't just a photographer, you know. So yes,
absolutely. But
he's just so hard to get right. But yeah, something would be a start.
Would you say his wonderful panorama of Titanic and Olympic is his most famous photograph, his most traveled photograph of all? So on the basis of that.
Yeah, it is, and it's the one that was commercially viable. But Niall McMichael referred to the fact that every photograph he took was this amazing tableau of, you know, interest in folk life. And you know, some of the photographs that Niall's referring to, for instance, the one of the, you know, settling of the potatoes, that's amazing.
That's
and
photo.
it is, you know, the fact that he documented that, and the fact that he got the two ladies involved to turn their spades slightly in a certain way to show that they were worn and the shape of them. And the fact that he picked a nice part of the field with the fairy thorns, and he was able to just, it was remarkable, his eye for pulling it all together and producing these really photographs that, will transcend history really, and will carry the message of what life was like for those periods down for centuries, forever really.
And I think it's a very good point to end on indeed. Thank you, Aidan.
Yeah, so
really,
thanks everybody.
Yes, and thank you very much for that. We very much entered the world of Robert Welch tonight, and it's a world that I must say I've many times got happily lost in myself, particularly on nmni.com collections, just going in and looking through his photographs. There's always another discovery to make.
Absolutely, and Ireland's Eye is something I think should be in everybody's book collection at home, and just get yourself a copy on eBay. They're not that expensive.
Yeah, it's a very good start for what would be a lifetime's love affair with a wonderful photographer who documented a certain period of Ireland. And thank you for that, Aidan. And I'd just like to thank everyone for attending the talk tonight, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aidan and Mark. That was very good of you tonight. I enjoyed